The Labrador Retriever lay still inside the cold metal cage, his dull eyes reflecting the weight of defeat. He was a prisoner on death row in the shelter, his time slipping away second by second. Days had turned into weeks, and still, no one had come for him. A large, scarred dog that flinched at every sound and shied away from every hand was not the kind of companion people were looking for. So he had stopped barking. Stopped trying to get attention. While the other dogs howled and whimpered, he simply lay there in silence, as if he had already accepted his fate. But then, something unexpected happened. Something that would change everything. That night, the shelter was eerily quiet. The occasional whimper or soft howl echoed through the facility, the restless cries of dogs longing for freedom. In a far corner, away from the entrance and out of sight, a German shepherd named Duke lay curled up inside his metal cage. His large body was pressed tightly into the corner, his once proud posture now hunched and defeated. The scars on his coat told a story of a past no one at the shelter truly knew, and likely, no one had ever tried to ask about. Weeks ago, Duke had stopped barking. He had learned that barking didn't matter. No one came for him. No one wanted him. Visitors passed by his cage every day, pausing only for a brief moment before moving on to younger, livelier dogs. He wasn't what people were looking for. His file labeled him as a large, difficult retriever with an aggressive history. But the truth was, Duke wasn't aggressive. He was terrified. Every raised hand reminded him of pain. Every loud noise sent a shudder through his body. But no one had noticed. To them, he was just another unclaimed dog. And tomorrow, his time would be up. The shelter had made its decision. There was no more space, and Duke had been deemed unadoptable. As the lights dimmed and the staff left for the night, silence settled over the shelter. The other dogs continued to cry out, but Duke didn't join them. Instead, he let out a quiet, broken whimper. It wasn't a plea for attention. It was a sound of resignation. And yet, somewhere in the darkness, someone heard it. On the other side of town, a woman named Emily sat alone in her tiny apartment, mindlessly scrolling through her phone. She was a veterinary technician, a woman who had dedicated her life to helping animals. But lately, she felt lost. She had always wanted a dog, but life had a way of giving her excuses. Her apartment was too small. Her work hours were too unpredictable. And she wasn't sure if she had enough experience to handle a problem dog. But that night, something pulled at her. A feeling she couldn't shake. She opened her social media feed, and there it was. A post from the local shelter. A blurry, low-quality photo of Duke, the underweight Labrador Retriever, lying motionless in his cage, his dull eyes staring blankly at the camera. The caption read, "Duke, 5 years old. Needs a home by tomorrow. Otherwise, he will be euthanized." Emily's heart sank. There was something in his eyes, something that called to her. She couldn't explain it. But she couldn't ignore it either. Her finger hovered over the screen as she stared at the photo for a long time. "You can't save them all." It was something she had heard countless times in her line of work. But tonight, those words felt hollow. Without thinking, she dialed the shelter's number. It was late, no one answered. But she left a message anyway. "Hi, this is Emily. I saw your post about Duke. I know it's late, but I want to help. Please, don't do anything until I get there tomorrow." As she hung up, a flood of emotions washed over her, fear, doubt, and a strange sense of determination. She didn't know why she had to save this dog. But she knew she couldn't ignore the feeling. Setting her alarm for sunrise, she lay in bed, restless. She had to be there the moment the shelter opened. Back at the shelter, Duke remained curled in his cage, unaware that, somewhere out there, someone had just decided to fight for him. Moonlight filtered in through the tiny window, casting a faint glow over his tired body. For the first time in weeks, he let out a deep sigh. As if, somehow, deep down, he knew his story wasn't over yet. And as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, everything was about to change. The early morning sky was painted in soft hues of orange and pink. At the shelter, the staff had already begun their daily routine, feeding the dogs, cleaning the kennels, and preparing for another day. For Duke, it was just another monotonous, lonely day. But today, something was different. Today was the day his fate would be sealed. Duke sat silently in his cage as the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. A woman named Karen, the strict but fair manager of the shelter, approached his kennel, clipboard in hand. Her expression was heavy with regret, but her eyes were firm. "I'm sorry, boy," she murmured. "We tried, but no one came for you." She moved on. Duke didn't react. He had already accepted what was coming. The bright spirit he once had was buried beneath layers of disappointment and fear. Meanwhile, Emily was already on her way. Driving through the quiet streets, her heart pounded, her mind racing with doubt. What if he's aggressive? What if I can't handle him? She whispered these fears to herself, but every time she considered turning back, an image of Duke's eyes flashed in her mind. There was something about him she couldn't ignore. Something that made her keep going. She pulled into the shelter's parking lot, gripping her phone tightly. The shelter's post was still open on her screen, Duke's picture staring back at her. Emily took a deep breath and rushed toward the entrance. Inside, Karen was glancing over Duke's file one last time when she heard the door swing open. She looked up, surprised to see a young woman standing there, slightly out of breath. "Hi, I'm Emily," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. "I called last night about Duke." Karen raised an eyebrow and glanced at the clock. "You're early," she said. Then, after a pause, she added, "But, you're too late. Duke is scheduled." "I'll take him." Emily interrupted, her voice ringing through the room. Karen exhaled, studying the determined look on Emily's face. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Duke isn't an easy dog. He's been through a lot. He has a history of aggression." "I know," Emily replied, her heart still pounding. "I know what I'm doing. Please, just give me a chance." Karen hesitated, but there was something in Emily's voice, something that made her reconsider. Finally, she nodded. "All right," she said, setting the clipboard down. "Let's go get him." Emily followed Karen down the hallway, the sound of barking and whining growing louder with each step. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant and damp fur. And then, they reached Duke's cage. Emily's heart sank. He was even more broken than he had looked in the picture. His body was curled tightly in the corner of the kennel, his head resting on his front paws. His dull, lifeless eyes barely registered her presence. Karen carefully unlocked the cage, moving slowly. "Be careful," she warned. "He won't be happy about this." Emily crouched down, her voice soft and gentle. "Hey, Duke," she whispered. "It's okay, boy. I'm here to take you home." At the sound of her voice, Duke's ears twitched ever so slightly. He didn't move, but for the first time, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Curiosity, maybe. Hope. Emily extended her hand carefully, making sure not to invade his space. The Labrador hesitated, his golden fur slightly trembling under the shelter's dim light. "It's okay," she said again. "I won't hurt you." Duke hesitated, his body still tense. But then, after what felt like forever, he moved. Just a little. He lifted his head slightly, nostrils twitching as he sniffed the air. Emily held her breath, keeping her hand steady. Slowly, cautiously, Duke inched closer. And finally, his nose touched her hand. A wave of emotion crashed over Emily. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Good boy." Karen watched in silence, her usual skepticism replaced with the hint of a smile. "You're in for a challenge," she said lightly. "But, maybe this will work." As Emily led Duke out of the shelter, the morning sun bathed them in warm light. His steps were hesitant, his body stiff, but he followed her. For the first time in months, he was outside. For the first time in months, he had a chance. The drive home was quiet. Apart from the hum of the engine and the occasional rustling from the back seat, neither of them made a sound. Duke lay curled up on the blanket Emily had placed for him, staring out the window at the unfamiliar world passing by. His body remained tense, his movements cautious. As if he couldn't believe this was real. As if he thought this was just a temporary stop before he was thrown back into a cold metal cage. Emily kept glancing at him through the rearview mirror, her chest tightening at the sight. She wanted to say something reassuring, but words wouldn't be enough. This was a dog who had learned not to hope. A dog who had learned not to trust. And breaking down those walls would take more than just kind words. When they arrived, Emily parked outside her small apartment. It was nothing fancy, just a simple building with a tiny patch of grass out front. She turned to Duke and smiled gently. "We're home, boy," she said softly. Carefully, she opened the car door, waiting for him to adjust before gently tugging his leash. Duke's ears flicked as he hesitated, but eventually, he stepped out. Nose to the ground, he sniffed the air, his posture still rigid and guarded. Emily led him inside at a slow, steady pace, careful not to startle him. Her apartment was small but cozy. A dog bed was already set up near the window. Fresh water and a bowl of food sat waiting in the kitchen. She had done everything she could to make this space feel safe for him. But as soon as she unclipped the leash, Duke didn't settle. Instead, he moved cautiously around the apartment, sniffing every corner, his movements stiff and low to the ground. As if he was waiting for something bad to happen. As if danger could appear at any moment. He reached the dog bed, sniffed it briefly. Then turned away and curled up near the door instead. His dark eyes stayed locked on Emily, watching her warily. There was curiosity there. But there was also fear. Emily's heart ached. She wanted to tell him it was okay. That he was safe now. That he never had to go back to that cage. But she knew words wouldn't be enough. This wasn't going to be easy. Duke had spent years learning not to trust, not to hope. And it would take time to change that. But Emily had made her decision. She wasn't giving up on him. Not today. Not ever. Duke's journey had just begun. And for the first time in a long time. He had a reason to believe in something more. Emily watched Duke carefully, her chest tightening as she sighed. She had expected this. She knew it would take time. But seeing him so withdrawn, so afraid to even move, was harder than she had imagined. She crouched down, her voice soft. "It's okay, Duke. You're safe here. No one will hurt you." For a brief moment, his eyes softened. But he didn't move. Emily decided to give him space and stepped into the kitchen to prepare dinner, hoping the scent of food would lure him out. But when she returned with her own plate, Duke was still in the same spot, his head resting on his front paws. Over the next few days, a delicate rhythm formed. Emily gave Duke as much space as he needed, never forcing interaction but always making sure he knew she was there. She spent hours sitting on the floor near his corner, quietly reading or working on her laptop, allowing him to grow accustomed to her presence. Little by little, he began to relax. His posture softened. His eyes lost some of their guarded fear. One night, as Emily sat on the couch watching TV, she felt something pressed gently against her leg. She looked down, and froze. Her heart nearly stopped. Duke had approached her, his nose lightly nudging her knee. For a moment, she didn't dare move, afraid she would startle him. Then, slowly, she reached out, hovering her hand just above his head before gently resting it on his fur. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Duke didn't pull away. He stood there for a few seconds, then retreated back to his corner. But in that small moment, something had shifted. A bond had formed. It was a tiny step. But to Emily, it felt like a milestone. That night, as Emily lay in bed, she thought about everything they had been through. The scars on his body. The fear in his eyes. All of it told a story of pain and survival. But beneath it all, she had seen something else. A flicker of hope. A spark that hadn't been completely extinguished. And she had made up her mind. She would fan that spark into a flame. No matter how long it took. As she drifted off to sleep, she knew Duke's journey was only just beginning. And whatever obstacles lay ahead, they would face them together. Weeks passed, and slowly, Duke began to change. At first, the progress was almost imperceptible. A hesitant wag of his tail when she called his name. Following her from room to room, always keeping a cautious distance but never letting her out of his sight. Every small step forward felt monumental, like tiny cracks forming in the walls he had built around himself. And Emily remained patient, just as she had promised. She never forced him to interact. But she celebrated every moment of progress. The day he finally curled up on the dog bed she had prepared for him, she nearly cried. It wasn't much. But it meant he was starting to trust her. Starting to believe this new life might not be so bad after all. One evening, after a long day at work, Emily decided it was time to try something new. She grabbed Duke's leash, knelt down in front of him, and held it out. "What do you think, buddy? Want to go for a walk?" Duke tilted his head slightly, his ears perking up just a little. It was the most curious expression she had ever seen on him. Encouraged, she gently clipped the leash to his collar and opened the front door. Duke hesitated, his eyes searching hers for reassurance. She stroked his fur. "It's okay." Together, they stepped outside. Cool night air wrapped around them. The neighborhood was quiet, lined with trees that rustled gently in the breeze. At first, Duke kept his body low, moving cautiously, his every step filled with uncertainty. But as they walked, he began to relax. His nose twitched as he sniffed the air, taking in the unfamiliar scents. For Emily, it was a bittersweet moment. She couldn't help but wonder. How long had it been since he had enjoyed something as simple as a walk? How many years had he spent locked away, robbed of the freedom every dog deserved? As they rounded a corner, Emily noticed someone approaching. An older man walking a cheerful golden retriever. Her heart tensed. She had no idea how Duke would react. She slowed to a stop, keeping a firm but gentle grip on his leash. "It's okay, Duke," she murmured. The golden retriever wagged its tail eagerly, and its owner offered Emily a kind smile. "New dog?" he asked. She nodded. "This is Duke. I adopted him a few weeks ago." The man crouched slightly, keeping a respectful distance, and extended his hand for Duke to sniff. Duke froze. His body stiffened, and Emily felt the tension ripple through the leash. For a moment, she feared he might lunge. But instead, he simply took a slow step backward. Wary, but not hostile. "Good boy," Emily whispered, relieved. The neighbor straightened, nodding in understanding. "You're doing a good job," he said. "It takes time, but they always come around." Emily smiled, grateful for the encouragement. As they continued their walk, Duke seemed more confident. His step steadied. His ears relaxed. And when they finally reached home, he walked beside her, his head held just a little higher than before. Later that night, Emily curled up on the couch with a cup of tea. She was exhausted but proud. Duke had done so well. Then, Something unexpected happened. Duke approached her. Slowly. Tentatively. And for the first time. He wagged his tail. Just a little. Then, carefully, he rested his head on her lap. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. Setting her tea aside, she gently ran her fingers through his fur. For the first time. She felt the warmth of his trust. "Good boy, Duke," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're safe now." Duke let out a soft sigh and closed his eyes, settling against her. For the first time since bringing him home. He looked at peace. And at that moment, Emily knew. She wasn't just rescuing Duke. He was rescuing her too. Just as everything seemed to be falling into place. A shadow from Duke's past reappeared. One night, as Emily tidied up her apartment, something strange caught her attention. A car. A dark, unfamiliar vehicle parked across the street. The headlights were off. But it hadn't moved for hours. Duke, who had been dozing near the window, suddenly lifted his head. His ears twitched. Then. A low, rumbling growl filled the room. Emily's stomach twisted. Maybe Duke's freedom wasn't as secure as she had hoped. Maybe. Someone was still watching. And maybe. His past wasn't finished with them yet. "It's okay, Duke," Emily whispered. "You're safe here." But Duke didn't relax. His growl deepened, his eyes locked onto the car parked across the street. Emily had seen him react to strange noises before, jolting at sudden sounds, flinching at quick movements. But this was different. This was deeper. Primal. She glanced at the clock. Past midnight. Something wasn't right. She needed answers. Taking a deep breath, she steeled herself and stepped outside. The night air was sharp and cold, sending a shiver down her spine as she approached the curb. The car remained where it was, its tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. "Can I help you?" Emily called, keeping her voice firm despite the fear clawing at her chest. For a moment, there was silence. Then. The engine roared to life. Headlights flashed. And in an instant, the car sped off into the night. Emily stood frozen, watching the taillights disappear into the darkness. She turned back toward the house. Through the window, Duke was still standing, his gaze fixed on the street, his body tense. Neither of them slept that night. By morning, Emily still couldn't shake the unease that settled in her chest. She picked up the phone and dialed the shelter. "I need to know more about Duke's past," she said. Karen, the shelter manager, hesitated on the other end. "There's not much information on him," she admitted. "He was found as a stray, but there were rumors." Emily tightened her grip on the phone. "What kind of rumors?" A long pause. Then, Karen's voice dropped lower. "Dog fighting," she said. "We can't confirm it, but that's what we've heard." Emily's stomach churned. Dog fighting. Suddenly, everything made sense. His fear of people. His flinching at raised hands. His deep-rooted distrust. And worse. If Duke had come from that world, it meant someone had put him there. And someone might be looking for him. Her fingers clenched into fists. She wouldn't let them take him back. That evening, Emily double-checked every door and window, ensuring they were locked tight. Then, she checked them again. Duke stayed close to her, his usual cautious demeanor replaced by something sharper. Heightened awareness. Like he knew something was coming. Like he was preparing for it. As the hours stretched on, the tension in the apartment thickened. Then. Duke's ears twitched. He let out a deep, guttural growl. Emily followed his gaze toward the front window. The car was back. This time, she didn't hesitate. She grabbed her phone and dialed the police. "There's a car outside my house," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "It's been watching us for hours. I need someone to come." The operator assured her that officers were on their way. But the wait felt endless. Duke stood by the door, muscles taut, ready. If anyone tried to come inside, he wouldn't let them. By the time the police arrived, the car had vanished again. Only fresh tire tracks remained on the rain-slicked street. Emily told the officers everything, but without more information, there was little they could do. "If they come back, call us immediately," one of them said firmly. She nodded. But deep down, she knew. Whoever it was, they weren't just watching. They were waiting. The next morning, Emily sat at her kitchen table, staring into her coffee. Duke lay at her feet, head resting on his paws. His eyes were half closed, but his ears twitched at every sound. He wasn't truly relaxed. Neither was she. Then. Her phone rang, shattering the silence. "Karen." "Hey, Emily," her voice was cautious. "I just wanted to give you a heads up. Someone called this morning. Asking about Duke." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "What did they say?" "They didn't give a name, but they were persistent. They wanted to know if we had any record of where Duke went." Emily's fingers tightened around the phone. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing," Karen assured her. "But, it felt off. Just thought you should know." Emily hung up, her heart pounding. She turned to Duke. He was watching her. As if he knew. As if he understood the danger as much as she did. "We'll figure this out," she whispered. "No one's going to hurt you. No one was going to take him back. She would make sure of it." That night, the storm finally arrived. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Rain lashed against the windows. Emily locked every door. Her heart pounded with every crack of lightning. Then. An engine roared outside. Cutting through the storm. Emily's blood ran cold. She peeked through the curtains. The car was back. Same one. Same dark shape sitting motionless in the rain. Its headlights were off. Its presence, undeniably deliberate. Her hands shook as she reached for the phone. "This is Emily Carter," she said quickly. "The car from last night, it's back." She had barely finished speaking when a car door opened. A shadow stepped out. A figure, barely visible through the rain, standing in the middle of the street. Waiting. Watching. And then. Duke let out a growl unlike any she had ever heard. Deep. Dangerous. This time, he wasn't afraid. He was ready. "The car is back," Emily whispered into the phone, her voice urgent. "Please, send someone now." The dispatcher assured her that officers were on their way. But Emily knew. It might take too long. Too long. She turned to Duke. He stood rigid by the door, ears pricked forward, muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. His low growl rumbled through the small apartment. A warning. A promise. Then. Footsteps. Undeniable. Someone was on the porch. Emily sucked in a breath. Duke's sharp bark shattered the tense silence, echoing through the apartment. Emily grabbed a flashlight, her hands shaking as she inched toward the door. "Stay here," she whispered. But Duke didn't move. He stayed by her side, his eyes locked on the door. A sudden rattle. The doorknob twisted. Emily's heart pounded as she flicked on the flashlight and peered through the peephole. She couldn't see his face through the rain. But the shape of a man was unmistakable. And he was trying to get inside. Before she could react, Duke lunged at the door, snarling with unrestrained fury. The intruder hesitated. Emily seized the moment. Police are coming. Get out of here, she shouted. The man cursed under his breath. Then he bolted. Emily rushed to the window just in time to see him sprint to his car. The engine roared. And then, he was gone. Again. When the police arrived, Emily told them everything, her hands still trembling. They promised to increase patrols, to keep an eye on the area. But she knew. This wasn't over. Whoever was after Duke. They wouldn't give up that easily. When the officers left, Emily leaned back against the door, sliding to the floor. Duke approached her slowly, pressing his warm body against hers. She wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his fur. "You're safe now," she whispered. More to herself than to him. "We'll get through this together." The next morning, Emily made a decision. She packed their bags, loaded Duke into the car, and drove. Far away. To the countryside. To a quiet place, untouched by the shadows of the past. A safe place. A place where Duke could finally be free. As they pulled up to a small farmhouse, Emily felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over her. This wasn't just a fresh start for Duke. It was for both of them. For the first time since she had brought him home. Duke wagged his tail. Stepping out of the car, he lifted his head, taking in the fresh air. His body relaxed. His eyes shone in a way Emily had never seen before. Tears welled in her eyes as she smiled. They had found what they had both been searching for. Peace. Duke turned to her and let out a soft, happy whine. A sound she had never heard from him before. Emily knelt down and wrapped her arms around him, holding him close. "You're my family now," she whispered. "And no one will ever hurt you again." Duke's journey, from a shelter cage to a life filled with love and freedom, was nothing short of extraordinary. His scars, both physical and emotional, told a story of survival. But more than that. They told a story of resilience. Of hope. Emily's unwavering determination to protect him proved something undeniable. That no matter how broken an animal may seem, love and care can heal even the deepest wounds. Duke wasn't just a rescue dog. He was a symbol. A second chance. A testament to the power of kindness. Together, they had left the past behind. And they had proved that no matter how dark the beginning, there is always hope for a brighter tomorrow. If Duke's story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with others who believe in second chances. Join us in rewriting the stories of animals like Duke, giving them the happy endings they deserve. Every rescue matters. Every act of kindness changes a life. Together, we can spread hope, one rescue at a time. Thank you for being a part of this journey.